Hi, everyone. How's it going? Howdy, howdy. I'm going to wait for my cue here real quick just to make sure that folks are on. We ready to go? Fantastic. So I got my cue here. I'm hearing folks are hopping on. I am really, really thrilled that folks are here. Shout out to y'all. Thank y'all so much for spending your evening with us. Gonna holler at my tech person here real quick, see if we can wait a couple of minutes. Is that okay? Or should we just go ahead and roll through? Okay, we got like 1 minute. Give folks an opportunity to hop on. Welcome, welcome, folks. Sounds good. I'll wait till a nice little clean 6:05, 6:04-ish for folks to hop on real quick. But if you are here, thank y'all so much for coming through. Thank you for spending your precious evening with us today. Um, to hear a bit about housing and tenant rights. Honestly, I can't think of a better way to spend an evening than getting real mobilized and galvanized and being in the mix with us. I'm really stoked that everybody's here and all the folks that are rolling through. Thank y'all so much. I don't know if anybody's curious, but I'm coming through from Houston. I'm out here in Harris County. Had a glorious day today, and so I'm quite grateful to close it off with my organizing folks and folks who are in the muck with it with me on tonight, on this evening. I'm not sure where folks are joining us from. I don't know if they're joining us from Facebook. If you're joining us from YouTube, we're streaming on both platforms right now. But feel free to comment with where you guys are joining us from and how you all are feeling right now. And as folks are doing their intro, I will go ahead and just open up the session. You all, thank you all again for joining us and spending this Thursday evening with us. So my name is Lois. I use she, they pronouns. I am a Housers Fellow and a member of Texas Tenants for Change. I'm not quite sure how you all have heard about us, but I'm so, so glad that you have arrived and you have come here this evening. So our group, Texas Tenants for Change, we are renters, we are concerned neighbors, and we are also organizers from across Texas who want to see better protection for tenants, ultimately equitable housing for everyone. In this series called Spotlight for Change, we're going to be highlighting some of the biggest issues that we're seeing surrounding tenant rights, and we're going to hopefully spotlight and discuss how we can solve them through policy change. So specifically for tonight, to unpack tonight's topic, which is evictions, we will hear from Tanika Brewster, aka Beeper, who's a tenant, and she will be discussing with me and speaking with me about her experience, her firsthand experience navigating evictions. We're also going to hear from Jen Rice and Rebecca Schutz, who are both journalists for the Houston Chronicle and who have covered the housing crisis during the height of the pandemic. And finally, We're going to hear from Ben Martin, who is a research director for Texas Housers, and he's a policy expert who will share some of the efforts that we're seeing around the state or from across the state and some unique barriers we're seeing to achieving equitable housing and the protections for tenant rights. So once again, I want to welcome everybody and thank everybody. Just to encourage you all to continue engaging with us, I want to invite everybody to just use that comment section. Feel free to ask questions, and we can uplift it through, uplift it and spotlight it right during the actual segment, and we can even maybe even highlight it during our reflection section towards the end. But feel free to just engage with us along the way. Without any further ado, we're going to jump right into that first kind of conversation with Taniqua, and I'd love to invite her onto the screen.
Hello, hi Lois.
How's it going?
Pretty good. Fighting bugs.
Right, that part. This is Texas, okay? We
Yes.
gotta stay ready. Beeper, where are you joining us from today?
I am actually joining from Austin.
Lovely, lovely. No, please tell the lovely audience, folks who are joining us today, a little bit about yourself and how you are also a Housers Fellow. So, you can also share a little bit of how you got into this organizing around tenant rights.
So, my name is Taniqua. I'm not originally from Austin, but I've been in Austin long enough to be from here. How I got a housing fellow. I'm with the joined Basta. Well, Basta came and saved us basically when we were in Basta is a organization for change. It helps with tenant rights and getting tenants' rights together. So last year right after the storm, during the pandemic, after Uri, we had a lot of issues with our complex. We had to literally fight with our owners of the complex to get our gas back turned on. Now these are gas led apartments, so we weren't able to cook. We had cold water. There was no heat, and these are the conditions we were living in right after Uri with the coldness. And one of the things that we had to do was organize. And so we started to organize. We built our own tenants association since last year, and all starting our tenants association over here in our complex. I've joined Texas Housers. I'm fellow Texas Tenants for Change, our newest project baby. I'm in another group called Tada. I did some national tenants alliance work, so just joining those to help the change and help tenants.
I'm kind of curious, Beeper, how long have you been a tenant? How long have you been a renter?
I've been a renter for the last 16 years.
And can you paint a picture of your experience as a renter? Have you always kind of understood or had a good firm grasp of your rights, how to navigate issues, or has this been more on the recent end of your organizing experience?
So it started. I knew that tenants had some rights, but the greatest thing, here in Austin, 55% of Austin is renters, tenant renters. And a lot of those that are not, if they're not living in a subsidized unit or a subsidized complex, they don't have as many rights as those that are subsidized through HUD. So I knew when I've lived in a HUD complex for most of my time renting. And so living in the HUD complex, they give you the tenant rights. Whenever you go and sign your lease, or recertification, whatever, you get the tenants' rights. So I knew about tenants' rights, but I didn't know how effective they were. So it just felt like something that was handed to you, but no one was actually upholding, landlords and owners weren't upholding their end of the bargain. They were collecting their check, and that was important to them. And so organizing, just learning to organize, getting together, actually reading over the rights, knowing our rights, knowing when you were in a situation that you needed to fight, and using your rights really helps.
So can you tell me, I mean, today's topic is about eviction. Can you tell me a little bit about your own firsthand experience, like navigating eviction?
So again, living in the complex where I live, and I've lived in this complex for 14 of the years, or a lot of years. Living in the complex, uh, 2018, I had just left my job, and I was getting paid twice a month, but it was never on the beginning of the month. It was like the 7th and the 22nd or something to that effect. And so I would pay certain bills on the 7th and then pay my rent on the 22nd. I was told by one landlord, hey, you can't pay it early because you're subsidized. And if you pay it early too much, you can lose your subsidy. Whether or not that was true, I'm not sure. So I go and pay my rent. I would pay the late fees. I was $1 short, $1 short on the money order that I turned in. And I the landlord filed eviction. $1 she filed eviction. I wasn't aware until the constable came to my door with the eviction. All of that, I ended up having to pay for the eviction that they filed. That should have been on the complex. I gave her the dollar. She didn't even inform me that you don't even have to give the dollar. We've already filed the eviction, so none of that was told to me. I had to pay the eviction to stop it. And I didn't go to court because I didn't know. That was a right that I didn't know. Had I went to court, I would have found out that the fact that that $1 was actually for the late fees and it didn't actually count towards the rent that I owed, I would not, the eviction wouldn't have even worked out. That would have been taken care of. So knowing your rights, learning about evictions, learning about the different steps that owners have to go through, and having someone who knows is really important. And that's what got me into organizing and wanting to learn about eviction so that I could educate those who don't know. Because education and organizing is important in this field when you're a renter, when you're a tenant.
That is so incredibly true. Like, Beeper, it's wild how every single time, and just in my own personal experience, I have conversations with other like renters who have navigated evictions. Like, the length that some of these landlords would go through, right?
Yeah.
And how like the lines are so obscure, like, and then the onus of responsibility just lives with the tenant to like navigate everything
Yes.
and figure out everything. Because I'm assuming like because of that $1, like you had to, you know, call off work so you can go to the courts. You had to call and keep up with the dates for the courts and like all and navigate all that on your own, right? Like, is that what I'm
Right.
saying?
And the crazier part, even crazier than that, they accepted my rent for the following month. So when I think back about it, I'm like, well, dang, she didn't even know what she was doing. She had no clue. So when you're dealing with a lot of people who are clueless or ignorant to renters' rights and regulations, these are the things these are the situations we end up with. More recently, though, I will say this victory happened in Austin. We had a couple of resolutions passed, or they were on that were on the for the city council. One was the right to cure, which is important, and then it was the tenants' right to organize, which was something that was not happening. Police were being called. Even us, when we started organize over here, after the conditions that I'm telling you we were living in with the no gas, they had put out hot showers, outdoor showers that weren't locked, that weren't clean during the pandemic. We were standing in line for hot meals. That was their that's how they helped. My daughter today has a burn on her arm from the hot plate to warm water just to take a bath. That's how bad it was. So yeah, it can be crazy, but I am happy that we at least got that passed. So the right to organize, there you can't call the police. You can't. We can organize. We can talk. We can get to know each other so that we can combat these things and fight for tenants' rights.
Beeper, thank you so much. That's
You're
incredible.
welcome.
It's incredibly powerful to hear how organizing and coming together has created, even however in whatever step, right, it has created a certain level of change.
Mhm.
I'm grateful that you got a moment to share your perspective and your lived experience. I'm excited to invite you back towards the end just to reflect on the rest of the segment. But for right
Mhm.
now, I'm going to invite our next guest. Thank you so much again. And
You're
I'll talk
welcome.
to you soon. Thank you, Beeper. So yes, our next guests are Jen Rice and Rebecca Schutz. I am very, very grateful for Beeper sharing her lived experience, and I'm really stoked to contextualize that with some of the reporting and the perspective that these two fantastic journalists are about to share. Hi, Jen. Hi, Rebecca. How's it going? Welcome, welcome, welcome. And yeah, how are you all? How are you doing?
I'm excited to be with you guys tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Of course. So, can you all very briefly take turns not only introducing yourself, but just sharing with us and the audience who all's experience covering housing in your field?
Awesome. My name's Rebecca Schutz. I'm from San Antonio originally. I've been in Houston for 4 years, a little bit more than 4 years. I came and covered real estate at first and then moved to just focus on housing because before I was also covering some of what was going on the commercial side. And what was the second part of the question?
No, you nailed it.
Oh, perfect. Okay.
Introducing yourself and sharing a little bit about yourself and your experience covering housing.
I'll go. So I'm Jen Rice, and I'm from Houston. And I actually never explicitly covered housing. I kind of stumbled into it, but during the pandemic, I was covering City Hall for Houston Public Media, and I just couldn't help but notice that Houston just did not have the same eviction protections that we were seeing going into place around the country, and noticed it very quickly. Like a lot of places were so, like Austin, for instance, was like so quick on creating policies. Houston not only, dragged their feet, but also never implemented things. So anyway, what I ended up covering housing because I noticed that the city wasn't doing things that other cities were doing. And also we have extraordinarily good eviction data in Houston because of the group January Advisors. They have like a dashboard on eviction data that they update every single day. So you don't have to do like a records request to get basic information, just update it every day. So we had good data and some would say bad policies, and that is why.
I'm sorry, I'm giggling because it's like we noticed and felt it was bad, but also had the data to back it up. Sorry, I find that to be sorry. So yes, no, I mean, I invited the both of y'all to speak a little bit about just like in covering housing, what was going on in the general landscape and what you all were observing. And I'd love for you all to speak a little bit to some of the context that folks perhaps didn't quite grasp just by looking at perhaps even just lived experience, right? Or sensing from what they were feeling or seeing, etc. And yeah, can you speak a little bit to that landscape of housing and particularly like speak to tenant rights as a focal point?
Well, I guess I would say if we're like looking at it through the lens of the pandemic, it was, I think when everything shut down, there was a lot of worry that things were going to be like the Great Recession. And what you really quickly saw were a lot of policies rolled out to protect homeowners that were sort of like a blanket moratorium on foreclosures, and then Lena Hidalgo stopped the foreclosure auction. So there was a period where there was like no foreclosure auction, even if someone did try to file foreclosure, even though there was this moratorium. Like everyone, there were like systematic things in place, and I think the response for renters turned out to be like a lot more piecemeal. It put a lot more onus on the individual renter. You know, like the renter had to find the right affidavit. They had to like explain it to the courts, you know, like, you know, it became possible for legal aid to be at court, but would you even be at court, you know, like, and then I think it also like soon became clear that all of these little eviction courts, I'm calling them little, the JP courts, were approaching these policies different. So it was just, even like the renter's aid that was rolled out, it was like the onus was on the renter to know to apply to the aid and work with their landlord. And it was very piecemeal, and there were lots of cracks to fall through, I think became pretty quickly apparent.
Yeah, agree with everything Rebecca just said. And my experience of reporting during the pandemic was particularly, I would say it accelerated for me. It got a lot more intense once the CDC eviction moratorium went into effect, because suddenly there was this policy in Houston that was like kind of almost the first thing we had. We briefly had the state moratorium, but it was in effect for like 2 months. But the national moratorium was really something that could actually help. And so I'm like a policy nerd. And so I just like really started going to the courts as much as I could just to see like in the courtroom, was it actually being implemented? And I was like, I know this is nothing new, that like judges interpret things differently and that justice is administered really unevenly. That's not new, but I was still like, you can still be shocked by things that aren't surprising, you know? And I was just like stunned going from one courtroom to a next and like witnessing how like some judges would like bend over backwards to make sure people understood their rights, and some would do nothing. So what that looked like was, and it wasn't necessarily a party thing, you know, I think Democrats would surprise you in how they behaved, and Republicans would also surprise you in the way that they behaved. So like one example was, I remember some tenants would come to their eviction hearing, and the judge would ask like, well, have you applied for rent assistance? And our tenant would be like, oh, that's not for me. Like I make too much. And like the judge would be like, okay, well, are you making $100,000 a year? Because if you're not, then this applies to you. Like you can get help. Like this does apply to you. The help is available for you. And so like, they didn't just say like, hey, did you submit, you know, this paperwork? They like actually helped to connect people when like they didn't think that it would help them. So anyway.
Yeah, I think I'd imagine, because both of y'all are based in Houston, but I'd imagine that's like statewide, folks were just flying off the seat of their pants, right? Like I feel like when it comes to renters, right? Like was that kind of like the sentiment you all were observing, even though I know you all are like locally, you know, here, but in Houston, but you know, was that kind of the sense that you all were getting statewide?
You know, it's an interesting question because I didn't go to other courtrooms, but it's the same system statewide, if that makes sense. I guess there was different, actually, I would say like when it came to renter's aid, other places in the state, they didn't even get the fund going for like a year. So people were getting evicted without renter's aid for a year. At least here, there was renter's aid for like a while. And, you know, and then eventually, you know, things changed around the beginning of this year where they were only giving aid to people who had an eviction already filed against them, which is, you know, which is tough because as soon as you have an eviction filed against you, you have this like black mark on your renter history. That's going to make it so hard to move forward. And it almost doesn't matter if you get the aid or if you have the case dismissed or if you have the case sealed, you know, like because these companies log as soon as something is filed. So when they do the tenant screening report, you get the flag, you know, no matter what the outcome was. But I would say the thing about like all these little JP courts, judges who are elected by people who it's very hard to get valuable data about what a JP judge's stances are going to be. You know, it's very disparate. Like that's the way it's set up in Texas.
I would add two things, which is one is this is just my perception of how it worked out, but it seemed to me that like Houston may have been quicker and more efficient with getting the rent relief money out because they didn't have the policies. Whereas, you know, there were some parts of Texas that did actually implement some policies. And so that rent relief, while also being critical, was maybe it wasn't the only thing that they like. The money wasn't the only thing they had to offer people. They also had policies. So I feel like Houston had like really had to get the funding going because that's all they could offer people. And then the other thing I would say is like, even though all the counties have the same legal framework to work with, we saw, for instance, in Dallas that the judges, the JP judges, for whatever reason, were able to sort of get on like a Zoom call together and just like decide together that they were like not going to hear eviction cases. You know, so they were able to do that. Whereas in Harris County, we're so much bigger. We have 16 JPs. They can't come to agreement on anything. You can't just like call a Zoom of like 16 JP judges in Harris County, which has like big ideological differences, and like expect them to agree on anything. So that was an issue too.
And we were seeing like hundreds and hundreds of cases each week, like all virtual, and it was I remember it being quite a nightmare. So this is my second to last question. Before I ask you all to give me some of your just like parting thoughts. You know, as journalists, you all are, in truth, like purveyors of you know just our understanding of what's going on in our world, right? Purveyor is a good word. Like you all are pretty much framing our truth, you know, here in our understanding of it, right? And I'm kind of curious as far as like the coverage of housing, as far as the coverage of evictions and tenant rights in general. What do y'all think is missing from that coverage? What do y'all think is folks could kind of spotlight a lot more, to frame our understanding a lot more comprehensively, a lot deeper, and ultimately also allow readers and folks who are engaging with the information you all are curating as agents and can engage with it essentially, right? And so, yeah, in short, what is missing in the coverage?
I guess like one thing I just hope people think about is that the way it works here is not the way it works elsewhere in the country. You know, tenants do have more rights elsewhere in the country. There are places where there is, you know, how they say like, oh, what do they say in like crime shows? You have like the right to representation in a crime court. You know, like there are places in the United States. There's like 3 states and New York City. I think it's like Maryland. I'm forgetting where else. Washington, where there is the legal right to counsel, and so. And that has changed the game. I think in New York City, after they implemented that, the number of eviction filings fell by 30%. Oh, yeah. I'm getting a comment. Over a dozen cities now also. So it's been shown to have like an impact on whether or not landlords even choose to file evictions in some cases, which with Bieber's case, I was just like, oh my gosh, if there was a right to counsel, can you imagine? So they're like, and since like an eviction is such a mark on your record, that's a really big game changer. They also show that like when people have the legal right to counsel, they tend to like settle on smaller amounts, you know, both sides. So they come to the table and negotiate a little bit more. What else? I feel like there's like a number of different, like, you know, the amount of tenant organizing in different cities are different and in different states are different. So you know, we're telling this story the way things are here, but, you know, I think it's always important to remember that it doesn't have to be like things there. You can set up systems in different ways.
I would add In addition to what Rebecca said, which is so true, I would add that one thing that's really missing from the coverage is the fact that like so many of the evictions that go on are not playing out in court, or even with eviction filings. Like the number of like we have really good data, like I said here on eviction filings, but those are the official evictions, whereas like so many of them are happening and we have no numbers for them. That needs to change. We like need to have better numbers somehow. We need to be able to capture numbers on like unofficial evictions. And it's so much harder to tell those stories in the news because, you know, when it's like an official eviction, we have like court filings and we have all these things to draw on. Like I've tried reporting on the unofficial evictions, and like our newsrooms are so understaffed and we are so tight on time that like to go through the process, which we desperately want to do, but to go through the process of like doing fact checking and stuff on something where we just don't have these court documents is like so much more difficult, but essential. And I think that's a gap that we really need to be able to address somehow.
And one thing that blew my mind was just there is no avenue to go to in like, at least in Houston, if you're illegally locked out. Like the police are like, it's not our jurisdiction. The sheriff's office is like, it's not our jurisdiction. And I was just shocked when I went to like all these different authorities and everyone was like, well, you know, like I only get involved if there's a court order. Yeah. Everyone was like, this isn't our place. And I was just like, yeah. And this is an area we have bad data about. But what I do know is that no one will take responsibility if you are locked out illegally.
And the way it's framed is usually very, you know, I'm not partial, I'm not taking any side really, but in truth, they are very much picking the side of the landlord. You know what I mean? It's like, hey, I'm not really going to support you, the tenant, the poor person, the person in need of housing. So, okay, that is incredible, fantastic context. I wanna give y'all a couple of just, you know, 2 minutes, 1 minute, if y'all have any closing thoughts, any parting thoughts for our audience. Anything you all would like to share in regards to this topic, in regards to your role in engaging with this topic, etc. Even words of encouragement, just because I know there's some organizers who have joined us here today, and like, you know, they also very, very, Rebecca, for example, the piece that you recently ran, we have been using it as a point of reference, also as, you know, in observing the ways in which, the insidious ways in which eviction impacts a tenant. And so like even any parting thoughts at all on the matter, for sure.
Yeah, I would just say it's like really daunting to, you know, like the whole, like a lot of housing rights things are really daunting because they can be like a little legalistic. And I just recommend like reaching out to resources, you know, like, you know, tenants organizations, legal aid, because there are people who care, who have sort of like interface with that. So that can be really helpful. You know, like you can, yeah. And I would just say like, you aren't alone, you know, whatever you're experiencing, this is like an issue that's really at scale. So there are a lot of people going through it, and I know it can feel personal or, you know, like shameful or hard to talk about. But when you think about how many people are going through it, you can see that it's a systemic thing and it's not just you. Me and Jen can't give advice, but we can maybe point you to someone who can. You can always reach out to us. We're on Twitter. Our emails are in our stories.
I would add two things. One is the JPs are elected judges, and there's so little attention to these races. I swear, like, I can't think of an election that would be easier to be able to change if a community got together. Like the amount, I don't know, there's so little resources going into them. I really think that's a place where communities can get more involved, is by running more candidates and supporting them more for JP. And then the other thing is I wanted to give some hope is I remember during the last legislative session, there was, remember how Austin had like the eviction moratorium in place for a really long time. And then during the legislative session, there briefly was about to be a ban on eviction moratoriums during disasters for the future. And it was like the middle of the night, and I was like watching the live stream from the Texas House, and one lawmaker was able to just like get it knocked off at the very last minute. They like basically got it, like they basically slid it in like late at night. And like one lawmaker was like, I saw that and no. And it just like goes to show that like, I mean, I was very worried about that actually going through, like that the next pandemic we'd be in a much worse place starting off by not having the ability to do that. And so it does go to show that like sometimes in the middle of the night in the Texas House, something saves the day, and like there's not a lot of fanfare for it, but like the good things do sometimes happen.
Thank you both for your time. I appreciate you all. And yes, see you out here in these streets.
Okay, boys, you're awesome.
Yeah, thank you.
Of course. See y'all soon. Okie dokie. So our next speaker is Ben Martin. I am really quite stoked to get some policy perspective to the issue of eviction. And so I'd love to welcome him on. Hi, Ben. How's it going?
Hi, Lois. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So a real quick introduction. Can you please tell us about you and the role that you are currently in?
Yeah. So my name is Ben Martin. I am the research director at Texas Housers. Texas Housers is committed to safe, decent, affordable, and stable housing for all low-income Texans. And ensuring that all Texans have a right to live in a neighborhood of their choice. And so we have been working with low-income Texans and Texas communities of color for over 30 years. We've been involved in tenants' rights for a lot of that time, and we really dug in on this topic of evictions, similar to the last speakers that we just heard, around the pandemic. And the reason for that really is that we saw during the pandemic, for all of the ways that this did or didn't work out on the ground for real tenants, we did see historic levels of funding to keep low-income tenants from being evicted in the form of emergency rental assistance. Primarily, we saw historic protections for tenants, the federal CDC eviction moratorium, local moratoria, and other protections put in place at the state and local level. It was really important for us to kind of get in the mix on this and to understand where this money was going. Was it all reaching the people who need it? Were justices of the peace actually doing what they were supposed to in terms of abating evictions, et cetera? And so there was a lot of work to do at this time. There's still a lot of work to do now in the state of Texas.
So with kind of like this breadth of experience in your role, can you speak a little bit to the strides that have been made around? I mean, you're talking about this historic amount of money being poured into low income tenants and renters and folks who are in need of housing. Can you speak to kind of like the strides that have been made across the state to ensure that folks have this support and protection and equitable housing is actually achievable? You can spotlight a few initiatives that you've been a part of and things that you think have been can speak to how efforts are actually kind of being put into place across the state.
Yeah, well, so right now we're in a really pivotal moment. We talked about that historic level of funding. We talked about those historic protections to keep people from being evicted. And we're really at this moment where it's kind of a best of times, worst of times, where those protections, which were real and substantial, are ending. Most of the emergency rental programs in the state have closed or are closing soon. The eviction moratorium is long gone. So we do still have, though, this visibility around evictions as a crisis for low-income tenants. We have new knowledge and relationships with local government, city government, county government, community-based organizations. Like, they spent this money. They spent billions of dollars and they reached low-income people to spend this money. But all of the support from the federal government is going away now. And so there's a huge question mark where we have this knowledge, we have this experience, but the funding and the protections at the center of that have gone away or are going away. And so we're really at this point where we're grappling with what are our local governments, what is our state government doing to try to leverage everything that we experienced and learned and were able to accomplish in preventing evictions during the pandemic. And we're seeing a lot of variation on that. There are some real bright lights at the local level. We've been talking a lot about Houston and Harris County. Recently, the Harris County government have made a few big strides. They recently passed $4 million over the next 2 to 4 years for access to legal counsel for tenants in eviction court. Now, the actual number needed to get to something like a right to counsel, like Rebecca was talking about, would be something more like $6 million per year. So we're really far away from that. The county has taken leadership in providing some of that funding thus far, but there's more money needed from the county, from the city, from the state government, and from the Fed. But we do applaud the money that the city or the county, has put towards that. Harris County has also passed a tenant protection policy to give better rights to tenants around evictions at properties that receive funding from the county. So if you're at a property that receives funding from the county, you have the opportunity to cure before a formal eviction is filed, to pay your rental arrears. Even if a formal eviction has been filed, you can pay and stay. And there's other pretrial mediation stipulations. As Beeper mentioned, Austin recently, last week, passed a right to cure. So this is an opportunity to pay the back rent that you owe before a formal eviction is filed. You have 7 days. So it really is just like heartbreaking to hear about that $1 eviction filing. A case like this, theoretically would not occur with a strong opportunity to cure and the right to organize. San Antonio really received a $20 million grant from HUD to pilot right to counsel for San Antonio eviction cases. So we're really anxious to see how this rolls out. There's local tenant organizers working on a tenant bill of rights that covers more than just evictions, but certainly eviction protections are in there. And the city of Dallas City Council right now is really wrestling with how to sunset their very tenant-friendly COVID era protections around evictions that give tenants a lot of time to access rental assistance or pay their rental arrears. They know that they are not going to be able to keep a COVID era protection in place for much longer, but there is some interest from council in continuing some form of that forward. So really, I think that this is an important time for everyone, no matter what city, county, area you are in the state, to really stay on top of your local leaders. We have the knowledge, we have the infrastructure in place that we didn't before the pandemic, and people are paying attention to evictions in a way that they weren't 3 years ago. Like there's a lot more visibility due to the work of our favorite journalists and many others to daylight this issue. There's a greater understanding that there's ever been in the state of Texas that there is a real eviction crisis. But without that sustained federal funding, it's going to be a little more difficult than it was last year to keep our local leaders on target in terms of recognizing and acknowledging that there is an eviction crisis for low-income renters, and that they need to be doing everything that they can be doing to learn from each other and to put protections in place to help low-income tenants.
I'm not gonna lie, Ben, I got a little giddy when you started just rolling out all the things that are happening. I mean, that's really incredible and very exciting. And I know it's largely due to the efforts of fantastic organizers who've been putting, just a ton of energy and a ton of pressure on this legislators and policymakers. But I know this is still a good way to go. You know what I mean? I know there's these municipalities and these cities and these governments, they're still facing a ton of challenges, even, I mean, statewide, right? And so I'm kind of curious if you could, in spotlighting all the efforts that are in place, if you could also kind of contextualize it to the challenges that we're still kind of facing. I mean, in addition to not knowing how session is going to go next year.
Mhm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, before we go too far in painting a really rosy picture of tenants' rights around eviction in Texas, it's simply not the case. It's worth being excited about this new attention being paid and new experience that our local governments have, and that people really care about this topic. We should be concerned about some of that infrastructure and some of that knowledge going away if we don't take advantage of locking it in place right now, and some of the interest from our local leaders. We should be very, very concerned about bad stuff, evil stuff going on in the upcoming legislative session. There are a lot of landlords and they have lobbyists and they want to get back to business as usual. They had it real good before the pandemic and they want it back like that. They don't acknowledge that there's an eviction crisis. They don't acknowledge the real harms that evictions cause to individuals, families, and communities. And they're going to put up a really strong fight. And they have the advantage in the legislature, which is conservative. There is reason for hope with groups like Texas Tenants for Change and other coalitions coming together. I think that organizers, tenants themselves, and other organizations that can step in a supporting role have as great of a chance as ever to really get the stories of low-income people heard and really in front of the ears and eyes of legislators this session. I mean, it's going to be tough. We're advancing some eviction protection and tenants' rights bills. There are other organizations that are doing the same, and we're going to put all of our weight behind that. We expect that organizers are going to put a lot of weight behind that as well. But we already know that the Texas Apartment Association is going to be filing a bill or working on a bill to preempt local government's ability to provide that right to cure that we're talking about. So the recent win in Austin, if they get their way, is going to be nullified in the next legislative session. So we want to enshrine a 7-day right to cure at the state level. Let's just give tenants that opportunity to pay their back rent across the board. 1 week to access available funding or try to scrape together funding before that black mark of an eviction filing goes on your record. But there's going to be a lot of pushback. And so it's going to take everyone coming together and sharing their story and really being clear about the harms of evictions for families and their communities. And there's a dollars and cents argument. The cost of rehousing someone is way more than the cost of giving them a little bit of extra time to stay housed in the first place.
So is the cost of criminalizing them. So is the cost of unhoused folk. It's like it's a burden on everyone, not just the one individual. I think, and this is kind of making a slight departure from the line of question that I had, but when thinking about policy, Ben, it just seems for at least the layperson, and this is just maybe just me, it seems so daunting. Like there isn't really room for me, the one individual, the one person, to really have a say, and that can be another aspect of a challenge and an aspect of a mountain to climb. Is there a way in which, in your experience, we have successfully disrupt that? It could be through like, is there data that shows that, no, your experience and you talking to your legislator, et cetera, does have an effect, et cetera, right? Like,
yes, yeah, I want to push back on this like so directly. You can get like eggheads like me talking to legislators all day long. They hear from all kinds of people like me. Who they don't hear from is people who have experienced an eviction, like in mass. Even more than people like me, they're hearing from the Texas Apartment Association. They're hearing a story every day in their ear about, I'm going to say, this is going to sound kind of offensive, I think, to the folks who are listening to this, but they're hearing a story that's like, these manipulative tenants, they're taking advantage of their poor mom and pop landlords. And there is a real need and opportunity for a narrative shift here for people to just speak what's happened to them, to their legislators. And I think groups like Texas Tenants for Change and other organizations can help kind of bring folks together, but whether on their own or as part of a group, to go and get your voice in front of legislators. They need to hear people's stories. Because they're hearing a story. It's just not the story of low-income tenants.
That part. So lastly, and this is kind of something that we talked about earlier, I feel like on a policy level, there's tons of room for innovation, tons of room for creativity, because I think, there is this staunch rigidness that happens once we reach a legislative level, especially on a state level, right? It's like, no, it can only look the one way. It can only look like these steps can only be the ones that can be taken, right? Like, can we, in our efforts to disrupt the mythology built around how inaccessible state policy is, also be bolder in our asks, right? Be more, demand a certain level of creativity and employ a certain level of ambition in the way in which we're trying to shape our world around housing. Is there room to do that, despite, even looking down the barrel of like a super conservative, legislator, right? Like legislation, right? Like, is there still room for us to be bolder in the way in which we demand, equitable housing and tenant rights and protections?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a balance that you have to strike in the state of Texas between being bold in your vision and realistic, hopeful, but realistic about what are the fights that are competitive, what is realistic to win given who's in the legislature. And so I think that it's kind of you have to do both things at once. You have to remember what it is that you're fighting for. Lois, when we spoke earlier today, you talked about housing as a human right. We're talking about housing choice for all Texans, for all low-income Texans. We're talking about tenant protections for all Texans, safe, decent, affordable housing conditions, stable housing. And when it gets really technical, that's when it comes to okay, someone sees a sliver of an opportunity to get some, conservatives in the legislature to buy onto something that will really help tenants. So again, it is a balancing act to be bold in our vision, but to also know that these wins that feel technical or small can have a real impact in people's lives.
This is the question I just asked is very much in tandem with one that was shared with us on Facebook. Myra asked, how do we get support from the tenants in Texas how can we get support from the tenants in Texas to make an impact in the legislators, right? So how can I'm assuming tenants in Texas really have their voice impact what is happening on a legislative level, and what big things can we do? Did you want to dive deeper, emphasize, maybe, nitpick a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm very excited to see what your organization is able to do in the upcoming session in terms of you all are community leaders and tenant leaders in your own cities and your own areas. Folks on the ground, and getting you in to speak, getting folks that you know in to speak. This really is one by one personal, getting folks bought in. I remembered something I wanted to say a second ago when we were talking about ambitious vision. I think that there is also room for creativity and not just following the bouncing ball in terms of how tenants organize. There's no playbook here. We're the underdog. If you've got a new idea, this is a great time to throw it out there. There's no wrong answer right now. Like any and everything helps. If it's if it's artwork, if it's a song, if it's some way to bring people together and some way to bring joy into a movement that has a lot of we're going to experience a lot of hard knocks along the way, right? Like, but this should be something that folks should feel excited to participate in.
And Myra, I'm also going to mention that Texas Tenants for Change is also doing these conversations and having these deep dives into specific topics, largely because we are also trying to amplify policy recommendations that the group is trying to push forward, right, around the specific topics that we're going to be discussing. And so at the end, I'm also going to highlight and spotlight some ways in which tenants across the state can also get involved with some of our efforts as well. In addition to a petition, there is also policy recommendations that we want to invite folks to kind of just chime in and have conversations about, etc. We have a question here from John, who is asking, how can people follow Texas Tenants for Change, and how can folks learn more about the Texas Tenant Bill of Rights? I will share how folks can follow Texas Tenants for Change, but I will give Ben an opportunity to share with some of the folks about how they can learn more about the Texas Tenants Bill of Rights. Can you chime in on that a little bit, Ben?
Yeah, well, so I believe what John might be referring to there, if that's a question for me, is the Texas Tenant Protection Act, which is an act that was, or it's a bill that was filed last session by Representative Wale, who has indicated an interest in filing it again this session. That has a really enhanced, an aggressive enhancement in protections for low-income tenants on conditions, on fines and fees, and around the eviction process. And I don't think I'm speaking out of turn to say that I think what we really hope for here is to get a hearing on this, so that everyone listening and more can come to the Capitol and say something about it, say why this is so needed, talk about how the scales are so out of balance in favor of landlords, and that this is causing real harms in people's lives. Texas Housers is going to put out our legislative agenda in the next, I would say, week or so. And there's going to be a lot of information about the Texas Tenant Protection Act on there. And more, and we'll make sure to include ways to get involved also. So watch for that at texashousers.org.
Thank you so much for that, Ben. I want to close with this question, because I'm still very excited when we had that conversation earlier about imagination. I think this is also context that I want to afford everybody who's kind of like listening in. On that creativity tip, on that innovation tip around policy, right? And being bold with our approach, not just with our asks, but in our approach, right? There is an element of staying grounded in what we imagine can be possible, right? In what equitable housing can be. And something that I think folks tend to be lost on is how we are currently living in what was imagined by somebody, right? But by a handful of people who said, you know what will be helpful for me and my pocket, and this handful of people who are behind me, and what will satisfy my greed and whatever, right? Will be what we're currently living in. So in an effort to like sustain us and motivate us in grounding ourselves in another imaginary, right? In another future. I wanted to talk with you just like very, very briefly and in closing about how we could also reframe our minds as like, hey, this can be changed. This can be molded in a different way, right?
Yeah, I love this idea, and I love this way of thinking about it, Lois. Like, we're not, it can be too easy to just take things as they are for granted, of like, that's just the way things are. And that really, I think what you're getting at is that restricts our imagination about what it might look like to actually live in a place where tenants do have rights, where affordable housing is plentiful, and people are able to thrive in the communities that they want to live in. You know, you mentioned that we're living in someone else's imagination right now. That's exactly right. And it's not just someone's imagination. We're living in the Texas Apartment Association's imagination. We're living in the world as they imagine it. It's not just the world as it is. It's the world as someone else, the Texas Apartment Association, and similar groups, similar interests, as they imagine it. So I think that should make us feel brave about imagining the world as we want to see it, and imagining that can be seen through.
When you told me that earlier, by the way, and that we can actually find the names of these people in these tables and in these circles, I felt so encouraged to like step up to any meeting that they have and be like, hey, your imagination is actually kind of whack. I hate it. But I thank you so much for that contribution, and thank you so much for this conversation. I really do appreciate you, and I'm really, really glad that you're in our corner and like in this fight for tenant rights. So I appreciate you, and I'll see you out here.
Thank you, Liz.
I would love to invite Beeper back onto the call so we can have a really quick reflection and tie this entire kind of evening and talking about evictions all together. Beeper, I mean, how are you feeling after hearing from all these folks? What's going on in your body, in your mind? Oh, love, you're still on mute. Hold on.
It's exciting. It pumps you up. It makes you feel like what you thought was impossible is actually possible. Over the last year, all the changes that I've seen, like even last Thursday, I went to city council. I actually spoke, and there were like people from the apartment associations, owners were actually there. And just like Ben said, they were making it seem like these tenants, they're asking for stuff and it's going to affect us in a bad way. And there was one of the things that I learned, because I started doing research, because people were telling me, hey, listen, we got 55% of renters. 55% of those 55% renters here in Austin and in this area, it's mostly single women. So do you know who the owners sent up to speak on their behalf? Women. They sent the women up, and these women were saying, I own 370 apartments units. I have 370 units, and if everybody gets 7 days extra to pay, then that puts me in a bad position with my mortgage. And so I'm looking like, so you just don't care about people being evicted, families being displaced, not having healthy house. Like when you don't have a stable home, nothing in your life can be stable. And it's just the truth. It affects kids in a traumatic way. It affects families. People lose jobs.
What I'm hearing though, Beeper, is that like tenants have understood, not tenants, sorry, landlords have understood that this is a framing thing, that they can frame the narrative however it is that they please, and tenants have to, squabble for whatever, reality that they have painted, right? Like whatever reality landlords have painted. And it's you're right though, it is very encouraging to hear that in truth, we too, if we put our organizing power together, we can also work to push against that narrative and work to frame their reality a bit differently in hopes of getting some of these changes in place.
And
Go ahead.
not to cut you off, and like Mara was asking earlier, how do we get tenants involved? Just seeing those small victories, knowing that these things can change, getting out voting, joining Texas tenants units, different organizations, just learning. That's the first step. The biggest step is education. There were so many things that I didn't know coming into organizing, coming into so many rights that I didn't realize I had. They did know the rights. The owners knew the rights. The landlords, they knew the rights, but they were just hoping that tenants would stay ignorant. So coming together, learning, being educated, knowing, and then fighting for these rights, knowing how to fight, knowing how to it really takes getting together. It really takes, and that's one of the big things about being a fellow with Texas Houser, getting to know everyone over this time. Oh, it's not just happening in my area. It's not just happening to me. This is happening to everyone. We're all being affected by this. And not just the low income or just the renters, everybody is affected. And so if we want to fix this, we have to come together and be educated.
It's wild that you say that, because like we got a homie from Amarillo. Like this
Right.
is an issue in like every single crevice of the state. So yeah,
Right.
that's very, very powerful. So we have been engaging in this topic of like eviction and tenant rights and housing in general for like months now as like
Yes.
fellows, right? But was there anything from today's conversation that like really took you aback? It's like, whoa, I did not know that. Like, was there anything that you felt was like, yo, that's kind of new actually?
Just learning that we have so many people in our corners. Because we don't, and just getting to know, like having Jen Rice, just having those people there that are actually in our corners and want to help. That's, I learned about Basta after going through what we went through with the winter storm, and the help that they gave us and their help, the way they helped the city, like every organization that I'm a part of now, it stems from the organizing with Basta. Like they were like, hey Beeper, hey Beeper, listen, you can, this group will be good for you. And so they've been helping me to just have that there. So yeah, learning that being here, learning that there are other groups and other organizations, and there are other people fighting the same fight is always great and a positive for me.
I agree. I mean, I love always being reminded that there are folks who are dedicated, one, to the truth, right?
Right.
And two, to employing like their expertise, their skills, their
Right.
time, their energy, to really, really digging and finding like information that is helpful to folks who do not have, you know what I mean?
The accessibility. That's another thing. That.
But no, Beeper, I really thank you so much for your time today. Thank you so much for coming back and like doing this reflection. In these last few minutes, I'm going to quickly close and invite everybody who's been in the audience to continue engaging with our work. But like in the meantime, I just want to thank you so much. I appreciate you so much, and I'm going to see you soon. Okay.
Thank you.
Peace. So to our audience, again, I can't thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope this segment was incredibly informative, and I hope it enriched you in your understanding of evictions, and I hope it motivated you and galvanized you to get engaged. I would love to leave you with ways in which you can continue interacting with our work and engaging with future series. So first and foremost, I would love to invite you all to hop on our petition. This petition is specifically has been designed by Texas Tenants for Change, and we are trying to highlight all the ways in which the state of Texas can really create better protections for tenants. I would love to invite you all to like and follow our Facebook page. The petition is actually on the Facebook page, so if you like and follow us on Facebook, you all will be given multiple opportunities to engage with that petition. You know, the topic for today was evictions, but this is one of 3 areas in which we want to highlight. And so if you like and follow us on Facebook, you guys will get multiple opportunities to engage with future Spotlight for Change episodes. And lastly, but this is definitely not least, I would love, this is just a personal ask from me, Lois Gallo, okay? But I feel also like other members of this group also feel the same way. Please continue engaging on these issues with friends and family. Don't feel hesitant to just pop it in conversation. You know what I'm saying? It's like, hey, how you doing? Have you heard that, tenant rights are actually not protected in the state of Texas? I feel like that's not wild. You know what I'm saying? So please continue engaging in this conversation. And I'm super, super excited to be in community with you all. I look forward to seeing y'all out here somewhere. And yeah, see y'all soon. Goodbye.